The gun was already in Della Doyle's hand when the sheriff of Caldwell, Kansas slammed his fist on the table and told her she had exactly 1 hour to ride out of his territory, or he would personally see her hanged for inciting a riot. She did not lower the gun. She stood in the center of that dusty office with her boots planted wide and her dark hair coming loose from its pins, and she looked at Sheriff Hal Greer the way a wildfire looks at dry grass, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous than anger, with absolute certainty. "You want to talk about riots," she said, her voice low and even, the kind of voice that does not need to be loud to fill every corner of a room. "Let us talk about what you did to the Harmon family last Tuesday. Let us talk about how you burned their deed. Let us talk about the 14 families you pushed off their land this spring so that your brother-in-law could run cattle across it." The deputy at the door had his hand on his holster. Greer's face had gone the color of beetroot. 2 other men she did not know stood in the shadows near the window, and something in the way they held themselves told her they were not lawmen. They were something else. Something hired and quiet and very dangerous. This was a trap. She had walked right into it. She had known the moment she crossed the threshold that it was a trap. She had walked in anyway, because Della Doyle had never once in her 27 years of living let a trap be the thing that stopped her from doing what needed to be done. That particular quality was precisely why she had already been labeled reckless in 2 territories before she ever set foot in Kansas. And it was precisely why she was now staring down a crooked sheriff with a pistol in her hand, and a wanted poster with her own face on it folded in her coat pocket. "Put the gun down, girl," Greer said, and she could hear the trembling rage underneath his forced calm. "I am not a girl," she said. "I am the woman who has documented every illegal land seizure you have overseen in this county for the past 8 months. I have names, dates, and the sworn testimony of 11 families. That documentation is already on its way to Topeka. Shooting me will not stop it. Hanging me will not stop it. You had your chance to be an honest man, Sheriff. That time is over." She backed toward the door. The 2 men in the shadows moved. She fired once at the ceiling, and in the explosion of plaster and noise and shocked paralysis that followed, she was through the door and onto her horse before any one of them remembered how to breathe. She rode north and then west, hard and fast, with Kansas growing smaller behind her, and the open plains opening up ahead like a wound that had not yet decided whether it was going to heal or fester. She rode for 3 days with very little sleep, eating what she had in her saddlebag and watering her horse at whatever creek she could find, because the territory felt suddenly very large, and she felt suddenly, for the first time in a long while, genuinely uncertain of where she was supposed to go next. She had sources in Topeka. She had a contact at a small abolitionist newspaper in Lawrence who had promised to run her account of the Caldwell land seizures. She had a cousin in Colorado who had once offered her a place to stay if things ever got too hot. But Colorado felt far and Lawrence felt dangerous, and what she actually needed, though she would not have admitted it to anyone, was a place to breathe. A place to stop moving for 5 minutes and be something other than reckless. The town of Mercy Creek, Colorado Territory, appeared on the 3rd afternoon like something someone had left behind by accident. A scatter of wooden buildings along a single main street, a water tower that leaned slightly to the east, a general store, a livery, a church that looked as though it had survived a significant argument with the wind, and a saloon that appeared to be doing considerably more business than the church. There was a land office and a doctor's shingle and a small post office, and everywhere she looked there were people doing ordinary human things. A woman hanging washing, 2 children chasing a dog, an old man arguing with a horse about whether or not it was going to move. Mercy Creek was not remarkable. Mercy Creek was not even particularly pretty. But when Della rode in on her brown mare with the dust of 3 territories on her coat, and a specific kind of exhaustion behind her eyes that had nothing to do with sleep, Mercy Creek felt like something she had not felt in a very long time. It felt like a pause. She took a room at the boarding house run by a woman named Elsa Mauer, who was stout and German and asked no questions at all, which was the finest quality a boarding house owner could possess as far as Della was concerned. She bathed, she slept for 11 hours, and when she came downstairs the next morning to eat breakfast, she sat across from a man who was reading a week-old newspaper with the focused attention of someone who intended to remember every word of it. He was not what she would have called immediately striking. He was tall but not ostentatiously so, built the way working men are built, wide in the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with hands that were large and calloused, and that held the newspaper with surprising gentleness. His face was tanned and composed, and weathered in the specific way the Colorado sun weathers things, not harshly but thoroughly, and his hair was dark brown with a slight curl that he had clearly made some attempt to tame that morning, and had not entirely succeeded. He had a neat, close-trimmed beard that was just beginning to grow past neat. He did not look up when she sat down. He looked up a few minutes later when Elsa brought the eggs and coffee and set a second plate in front of him, and then his eyes found Della's for a brief moment. Brown eyes, very still, the kind that take in a great deal more than they show, and he nodded once in the courteous, non-committal way that people in the West use to acknowledge a stranger without committing to an opinion about them. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He went back to his newspaper. She ate her eggs. It was possibly the most comfortable silence she had sat inside in 3 years. His name, she learned from Elsa later that morning, was Luke Graves. He ran a cattle ranch about 6 miles south of town called the Sable Creek Ranch. He had owned it for 4 years, having come to Colorado from New Mexico after the war, and he was in town once a week for supplies, and occasionally, when Elsa had a spare room and he had a reason to stay over, he boarded here for a night. He was, Elsa said, very quiet, very reliable, the kind of man who fixed things when they were broken and did not talk about it afterward. "Is he kind?" Della asked. Elsa considered this. "He is the kind of man who carried old Mr. Whitfield's groceries home every week for a year after Whitfield broke his hip, and he never told anyone he was doing it," she said. "You can decide for yourself whether that is kind." Della decided it was. She had not come to Mercy Creek looking for anything except a pause. She had certainly not come looking for a quiet rancher with still brown eyes and a habit of reading newspapers with such complete attention that the rest of the world ceased to exist for him. She had a story to write. She had testimony to file. She had enemies in at least 2 territories and a reputation that had preceded her into this one, though she did not yet know it. She found out about the reputation 2 days later, when she walked into the general store to buy writing supplies and overheard 2 men talking near the counter. "Heard there was a woman in town," one of them said. "Dark-haired woman came in from the east, Della Doyle." "The land reformer," said the other. "The troublemaker is what they call her in Caldwell, and before that in Wyoming, and before that in Nebraska, I think." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that involves telling the truth in places where the truth makes powerful men uncomfortable," said a third voice. Both men at the counter turned around. Della, who had paused in the doorway, did not move. The third voice belonged to Luke Graves, who was standing at the back of the store with a sack of feed over one shoulder, looking at the 2 men with the same composed expression he wore apparently as his default setting. "Luke," said one of the men, with the cautious tone of someone recalibrating. "You know her." "I had breakfast across from her 2 mornings ago," he said. "She has very good table manners, and she reads faster than I do, which is saying something." He looked at Della then, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "Ma'am," she found her voice. "Mr. Graves." The 2 men looked at each other, then at Della, then at Luke, then decided that the best course of action was to purchase their tobacco and leave, which they did with admirable efficiency. Luke set his feed sack down against the wall and walked to the counter. "You heard all of that," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she said. "I am sorry for it," he said. "Greer sent a telegram to the county seat 2 days ago. Your name is in it. I have a friend at the telegraph office." The word "trapped" formed itself briefly in her chest, cold and sharp. "How much trouble am I in?" she asked. "Depends on who you ask." He paid for his items with a quiet efficiency, then turned to look at her with those steady eyes. "Are you actually reckless?" he asked. "Or do you just make reckless look like the only logical option available?" She stared at him. "That is a remarkably perceptive question for someone I have had exactly one meal near." "I read a lot," he said simply. "And I have been watching you since you rode in. The way you watch a town when you enter it, not the way a criminal does, watching for escape routes. More like the way someone does when they are trying to figure out who is hurting and what the mechanism of the hurt is." It was the most precise description of what she did that anyone had ever offered her, and it came from a man she had known for less than 3 days, and she did not quite know what to do with that. "Come out to the ranch," he said then. "Not permanently, just come and see it. You need somewhere to work that is not a boarding house room, and you need somewhere the county sheriff's deputies are unlikely to look for you immediately. I have a study with a desk. I keep to myself. No one will bother you." "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You do not know me." "I know enough," he said, "and the land reformers are right. What is happening to the small ranchers and homesteaders in this territory is wrong. I have seen it with my own eyes. If you are documenting it, that work matters." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I accept, thank you." He picked up his feed sack. "I ride out tomorrow morning early. You are welcome to come along." She rode out with him the next morning at first light, and the drive to the Sable Creek Ranch was one of those unexpectedly quiet and perfect things that happen between two people who are both comfortable with silence, because they spent most of it not speaking, and it was not uncomfortable at all. The land opened up as they left town, becoming wider and more golden and more itself, and Della felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the specific sensation of a place being worth looking at for its own sake rather than for what she might write about it. "It is beautiful," she said, surprising herself. He glanced at her sideways. "Most people say that once they are past the first ridge, it hides itself a little near the road. Like it wants you to work for it," she said. "Yes," he said, and there was something in his voice that told her he had felt exactly that and had never said it quite that way before. Exactly like that. The ranch came into view on the other side of a long slope. A solid, well-maintained house, a barn that was newer than the house, 2 outbuildings, a bunkhouse, and a stretch of fenced pasture where cattle moved in the long morning light like slow, copper-colored thoughts. It was not grand. It was the kind of place that had been built by someone who intended to stay, and who had put every spare hour into the slow work of making it sturdier and more livable, one improvement at a time. "How many hands do you have?" she asked as they rode down toward the yard. "3 full-time," he said. "2 seasonal, good men." He paused. "I pay fair, fed and housed. I do not take advantage." She looked at him. "You said that as though you expected me to check." "I expected you to check," he said. She almost smiled. "I was going to check," she admitted. The house inside was cleaner than she expected and warmer, with a kitchen that showed signs of actual use, and a parlor that had books on every available surface in the way that suggests accumulation rather than decoration, and a study near the back that had a wide desk near a window that looked out toward the eastern ridge, where the light came in long and golden in the mornings, and the shadows stretched out long and blue in the evenings. It was, without any exaggeration at all, exactly the kind of space she would have designed for herself if she had been given the choice and the materials. "You can use it," he said from the doorway. "The desk. I spend most of my time in the barn or the pasture this time of year. I usually only come in here in the evenings." "What do you do in here in the evenings?" she asked. "Read," he said. "Write letters, think." "What do you think about?" He looked at her with those still eyes. "Today," he said, "I will probably think about the question of whether a woman who has been labeled reckless in 3 separate territories is actually reckless, or whether the territories have been applying the wrong label." Her heart did something she did not give it permission to do. "3 territories," she said. "You heard about the third one already." "The telegraph is a very efficient instrument," he said. She set her saddlebag down on the desk. "Nebraska," she said. 3 years ago. "A water rights dispute. I published a piece that named the men who were diverting the river to starve out the smaller farms downstream. One of those men was a territorial judge. He had me removed from the territory. Removed, he said, escorted to the border by 2 deputies, she said, which I considered a significant improvement over what happened in Wyoming, which involved being shot at. He was quiet for a moment. Shot at, he said. I was not hit, she said. I am a very fast rider. I noticed, he said. You have good instincts with a horse. She looked at him. He was still leaning in the doorway with that composed, steady quality, and she realized that nothing she had just said had alarmed him. Not the shooting, not the escort to the border, not any of it. Not because he was indifferent to it, but because he had already factored it in. He had already decided, somewhere between the general store and here, that the scope of her experience was not a warning sign but a context. "Mr. Graves," she said. "Luke," he said, "please." "Luke," she said, "why are you really doing this?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My father lost his ranch in New Mexico when I was 16, not to drought or to misfortune. To a man with political connections and a fraudulent claim and a county recorder who owed him a favor. We had no documentation, no one to speak for us. We had nothing and we lost everything." He looked out the window. "When I heard your name in that general store, and when Reeves said you were a troublemaker, the first thing I thought was that troublemakers are very often just people who are doing the work that the honest citizens are too frightened to do themselves." She stood very still. "The second thing I thought," he said, "was that the land here could use someone who is not frightened." He left her to her work and she worked. She spent 3 days at that desk writing the piece on the Caldwell land seizures, organizing her documentation, writing letters to her contact in Lawrence, and to a newspaper editor in Denver she had corresponded with twice before. She was thorough and precise because precision was her armor. The more exact her documentation, the less room there was for the men she wrote about to claim that she had fabricated or exaggerated. She saw Luke at mealtimes. He cooked, which surprised her. Simple, adequate meals, competent rather than inspired, and he did not seem bothered that they shared the table in the same easy silence they had managed at the boarding house. In the evenings he came to the study when she was done, and she moved to the parlor, and sometimes she read and sometimes she wrote letters, and sometimes they simply existed in the same room at either end of the day, which was a strange and settling thing. On the 4th evening she asked him how he had built the ranch from nothing. "I came here with 2 horses, $200 I had saved over 8 years of hired work, and one contact who told me the Sable Creek Valley was undervalued," he said. He was cleaning the lamp glass with a cloth, doing it with the same meticulous care he seemed to bring to everything. "I bought 160 acres, lived in a tent for 6 months, built the house room by room, bought stock a little at a time. Made every mistake there is to make and learned from all of them." "You never married?" she asked, and then immediately felt the question land in the room with more weight than she had intended and said, "Forgive me, that is, it is a reasonable question," he said, setting down the lamp. "No, I came close once about 3 years ago. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She was a school teacher, very sensible woman. We understood each other, but we did not." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes. "Not grief exactly, but the quieter thing that comes after grief has been processed. We did not reach each other. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said, "it makes complete sense." "She married a banker in Denver last spring," he said. "I was glad for her. She needed the kind of life I could not provide." "What kind of life could you not provide?" she asked. He thought about it. "A settled one," he said. I was always building. She needed someone who had already arrived. I have not arrived yet." He looked at her. "Have you?" She thought about the last 3 years, the papers she had written, the territories she had moved through, the nights in boarding houses and the mornings on horseback, and the ongoing accumulating weight of knowing that the work was necessary, and also that it cost her something she could not quite name but could feel clearly whenever she stood still long enough to feel anything. "No," she said honestly. I have not arrived yet either. The moment held between them like a note struck on a string that neither of them had intended to play. He looked away first, back at the lamp. Your work matters, he said quietly. The piece you are writing, it will reach people. If someone publishes it, she said. It will be published, he said, with a calm certainty that was not dismissiveness but something closer to faith applied to a practical question. You write with the kind of clarity that makes it impossible for an honest editor to turn away. She looked at him for a long moment. You read what I wrote, she said. He had the grace to look slightly caught. The pages you left on the desk when you came to dinner last night, he said. I should have asked first. I apologize. What did you think? She asked. That you are one of the most precise and dangerous writers I have ever encountered, he said, and that every man you have written about in that piece deserves every word. The warmth that moved through her chest at that was startlingly uncomplicated. It was the warmth of being understood in the specific way you most want to be understood, not admired exactly, but seen accurately. Seen for the thing you are actually trying to be, rather than the thing that makes other people comfortable. She stayed another week, and then another. She told herself it was because she was waiting to hear back from her contacts in Denver and Lawrence. She told herself it was because the study was excellent and the light was perfect, and she was more productive here than she was anywhere else. She told herself it was the practical matter of safety, because Greer's deputies had been spotted asking questions in Mercy Creek, and it was genuinely safer to be 6 miles out of town for the time being. All of those things were true. None of them were the only reason. She began to ride with him in the mornings, when the work on the ranch was being done, and she was waiting for her thinking to settle before she sat down to write. She had grown up with horses. Her father had been a horse trader in Missouri before the war, and she knew cattle country the way people know things they absorb in childhood without realizing it, as a kind of bodily knowledge rather than a learned one. She knew how to read the land for water and for grass quality, and for the signs that a season was about to turn. She knew how a herd behaved when it was stressed versus content, and she noticed things about the pasture rotation and the fence lines that she mentioned one morning almost without thinking, and he pulled his horse up and looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. That is exactly the problem, he said. The east pasture. I have been trying to work out why the grass is thin in the south quarter. I have looked at the soil and the water table and I have not found the answer. Shade, she said. The ridge blocks afternoon sun for about 3 hours, enough to slow the growth cycle. If you rotated the herd out of there by the first week of the month and let it rest until the end, you would get better recovery. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the east pasture. Yes, he said, I think you are right. They stood their horses on the slope looking down at the pasture, and the morning was very clear and the air smelled of sage and cold water, and he said without looking at her, Where did you learn that? My father, she said. He understood grass. He said if you understood grass, you understood everything, because grass is the thing everything else depends on. He sounds like a wise man, Luke said. He was, she said. He died in 1864, the war. She said it the way she had learned to say it, factually and with a steadiness that was hard-won rather than natural, and Luke heard the difference between the word and the feeling behind the word, and he said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. They rode back toward the barn without speaking, and it was not the comfortable silence of the early days but a different kind, the kind that has something in it, some new tender thing that neither person has named yet because naming it would change it, and it is so new and so good that neither of them wants to risk the change. The trouble came from the direction she had not anticipated. She had been watching for Greer's men. She had not been watching for Daniel Rourke. Rourke rode into Mercy Creek on a Wednesday morning in mid-October, which is to say he rode in just over 3 weeks after Della had arrived, and he rode in with 2 men at his back and a legal document in his coat pocket, and he was not a sheriff or a deputy or any kind of law enforcement. He was a land agent. He was, specifically, the land agent for the Colorado Territorial Land and Development Corporation, which had been acquiring property in this county for 2 years by means that ranged from questionable to outright fraudulent, and which had Della's name on a list of people to be neutralized before they could cause any significant interference with the corporation's plans for the valley. She learned this from a man named Thomas Beaumont, who was one of Luke's 3 full-time ranch hands, and who had a brother who worked at the land office in town, and who came back from a supply run on Wednesday afternoon with the news that a man named Rourke had been asking questions about the ownership of Sable Creek Ranch and about the woman who had been seen riding on its land. Della was in the study when Thomas told Luke. She could hear them through the open window. She heard Luke say, "What kind of questions?" in that measured, level voice, and she heard Thomas say, whether the land was fully deeded and whether the woman was using it as a base of operations, Mr. Graves, those were his exact words, and she heard Luke say, "Thank you, Thomas," and then heard his boots on the porch steps and the door opening. He came to the study doorway. She was already looking at him. "Rourke," she said, "I know the name. He is with the Colorado Territorial Land and Development Corporation. They have been trying to acquire land in this valley for 2 years. The Parsons family, the McGee brothers, the widow Hollies, 3 of the families I have documentation on were approached by Rourke before other pressures were applied." "Other pressures," he said. "Legal harassment," she said. "False liens. Property tax disputes that materialized out of nowhere. In 2 cases, destruction of property." She paused. "Luke, I need to tell you something I should have told you when I arrived." He came into the study and sat down in the chair across the desk from her, and waited with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of close attention. "The documentation I have," she said. "The sworn testimonies and the records, they do not only cover Caldwell, Kansas. I spent 6 months before Kansas in this territory. I have documentation on 8 families in this county who were approached by the corporation and subsequently lost their land. I was building a case, a real one. Not just newspaper articles, but actual legal evidence that I intended to give to a territorial judge in Denver who has been corresponding with me for 4 months about the corporation's activities." He looked at her. "And Rourke knows this." "Rourke may suspect it," she said. "Greer certainly does. That is why the telegram from Caldwell was so urgent. It was not just about me embarrassing a local sheriff. I embarrassed the corporation by running from them because they were confident they had trapped me in that office and I walked out." "You walked into a trap on purpose," he said, not angrily, with the tone of someone who is rearranging their understanding of events. "I walked into a trap because it was the only way to get Greer to reveal his connection to the corporation," she said. "I needed him to say it in front of witnesses, and he did, and 2 of those witnesses have since given me written statements. That is what I have been writing here, Luke, not just the Kansas story, the whole story." He was silent for a long moment. "The whole story," he said, "puts you at significantly greater risk than I understood." "Yes," she said. "And me," he said. Not with accusation, just accurately, she met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "And you, I should have told you, I am sorry." She stopped, and it was an unusual sensation being stopped like that, being stopped by the truth that she had made a choice based on something other than pure strategy. "I needed somewhere to breathe," she said finally. "And this was the first place I had breathed in a long time, and I did not want to lose it by explaining everything immediately." He looked at her for what felt like a long time. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. It just settled. The way the land settles after a wind passes through it, heavier and stiller than before. "What do you need to finish the documentation?" he said. "I need 2 more things," she said. "A deposition from a man named Harris Polk, who was foreman at the Parsons Ranch when the property was seized. He is in Pueblo now. And I need to confirm the name of the judge in Denver who is handling the corporation's private disputes, a corrupt one, not the one I have been corresponding with. He is the man who has been signing the fraudulent documents." "I can get you to Pueblo," he said. "I have business there in any case. And for the other, let me think. I have a contact in Denver who may know." He paused. The documentation, when it is complete, where does it go? To Judge Everett Caldwell in Denver, she said. He is the honest one. He has been waiting for what I have. Then we have work to do, he said. And we should move quickly because Rourke will be asking questions in town about this land, and the moment anyone confirms you are here, we lose whatever lead we have. She stared at him. You keep saying we. He looked mildly puzzled. Yes, he said, we. You are a rancher, she said. You have a ranch here, a business, employees. If you involve yourself in this directly, the corporation will come after your land. They may come after my land anyway, he said. If the documentation you have is as comprehensive as you say, they will not be grateful for having it used against them in court, and I am associated with you now whether I intend it or not. He paused, and even if none of that were true, what is happening to these families is wrong. It was wrong when it happened to my father. It is wrong here. I'm not inclined to stand aside and manage the outcome of my own conscience simply to protect my acreage. She was quiet. The late afternoon light came through the window and lay across the desk between them, warm and orange and very steady. All right, she said. They planned. They worked through the evening and into the night, her at the desk and him moving around the room, talking through logistics, making lists, assessing risks. He was methodical without being rigid. He listened when she corrected him and adjusted without defensiveness. And she caught herself watching his hands as he worked, those large calloused hands that handled everything with such care. And she looked away each time because the watching was becoming something she was not ready to address. She was 31 days into not addressing it when he kissed her. It did not happen dramatically. It happened on the porch on a clear November morning when they had just come back from the eastern pasture where they had been checking the fence line, and she had made a joke about something. She could not afterward remember what, only that it had been a small, silly joke about crows, and he had laughed. A real laugh, not the near smile he usually permitted himself, but an actual laugh, and the sound of it was so warm and unexpected that she had turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and what she saw in his face was something she had been carefully not naming for weeks. It was a very simple kiss. Not tentative and not aggressive, just honest, the same quality he brought to everything else, and when he pulled back he looked at her with those still brown eyes and she could feel her heart doing something complicated and wonderful and a little terrifying. I have been wanting to do that for approximately 3 weeks, he said. You are very patient, she said. I was not sure it was welcome, he said. It was welcome, she said. And then, because she was Della Doyle and honesty was not a choice for her but a reflex. I am not a simple woman, Luke. I am not going to become simple just because someone has kissed me. I have work to do and places to be, and I cannot promise you. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to promise me anything. I'm not a simple man either. I'm just asking you to let this be real, whatever it is. She looked at him for a long moment, at this quiet, careful man who had read her writing without being asked and corrected his east pasture rotation based on her father's wisdom about grass and cooked her simple, reliable meals for 5 weeks without once making her feel as though she owed him anything for any of it. It is real, she said. It has been real for a while. He reached up and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with a gentleness that made something behind her sternum go very soft. And then he said, Pueblo tomorrow. Early start. Pueblo tomorrow, she said. Early start. They rode to Pueblo with Thomas riding with them, because Luke had decided that an extra horse and an extra pair of eyes was practical given what they were riding into, and Thomas was not merely adequate but genuinely reliable. A compact, serious-faced man of about 40 who had been with the ranch since the beginning and who, Della gathered, knew more about the history of land disputes in this county than almost anyone. Harris Polk was exactly where her information had placed him, running a livery stable on the south side of Pueblo with the brisk efficiency of a man who has found his correct occupation after trying several wrong ones. He was 60, iron-haired, with the specific expression of someone who has witnessed an injustice and has been carrying it in his body ever since. He agreed to give a deposition. He had been waiting for someone to ask. He sat at the table in the back room of his livery, with a notary that Luke had arranged in advance. Another example of Luke's methodical preparation that she found, now that she was allowing herself to find things about him, and he told her everything. The night the Parsons family's deed had been altered, the foreman from the corporation who had ridden in and told him to be gone by morning or face consequences, he would not survive. The documents he had seen signed by a man whose name he gave with a kind of audible relief, as though he had been holding it like a stone inside his chest for 2 years and had finally been permitted to set it down. The name was Judge Absalom Pierce, not a Denver judge. A circuit judge whose territory ran through 3 Colorado counties and who had been using his position to legitimize the corporation's fraudulent claims for at least 4 years. It was the missing piece. They rode back to Sable Creek the following day with the completed deposition and Della's mind working at a pace that made conversation difficult, and Luke let her think without interrupting, which remained one of his best qualities. By the time they reached the ranch, she had the shape of the whole thing in her head, the structure of it, the way the evidence fit together, the specific argument she would make to Judge Everett Caldwell in Denver. She had enough. She had more than enough. "I need to go to Denver," she said as they unsaddled the horses in the barn. He nodded once. "When?" "As soon as I can prepare the full document," she said. 3 days, maybe 4. He worked the saddle off his horse and set it on the rail with that economy of motion he had. "I will come with you," he said. "Luke, you are carrying documentation that implicates a sitting territorial judge and a corporation with significant political connections," he said. "You are not riding to Denver alone." She wanted to argue. She could not think of a good argument because he was correct. "Your ranch," she said. "Thomas can manage 4 or 5 days," he said. "He has before." "You have not been away from it since I arrived," she said. He looked at her over the horse's back with a directness that she felt in her sternum. "No," he said. "I have not had a reason that seemed sufficient." She held his gaze. "And now you do," she said. "And now I do," he said. She finished the document in 3 days. It was the best work of her life, thorough, precise, layered, and written with a clarity that made the truth of every claim self-evident. She wrote a covering letter to Judge Caldwell explaining the chain of evidence and the witnesses and the specific documents that proved the circuit judge's corruption. She made 2 copies of everything, because Della Doyle had not survived this long in this line of work by keeping only 1 copy of anything. On the night before they were to leave for Denver, she came to the study after dinner and found him there already, sitting at the desk with a letter in his hands that he had apparently been staring at for a while without reading. He looked up when she came in. "What is that?" she asked. He handed it to her. It was from the Colorado Territorial Land and Development Corporation. It had been delivered that afternoon, addressed to him at the Sable Creek Ranch, and it informed him in polite and legally precise language that the corporation had become aware of certain irregularities in his original land purchase, and that it would be in his best interest to discuss the matter before legal proceedings became necessary. "They are threatening you," she said. "They are attempting to," he said. "There are no irregularities in my land purchase. My deed is clean. But that does not mean they cannot make the process of proving it expensive and time-consuming." She stood holding the letter, and something hot and furious and also frightened moved through her. "Luke, this is because of me. This is directly because of me." He stood up. "This is because of them," he said. "They have been doing this to people for 4 years. The only difference is that now someone is about to hand evidence of it to an honest judge. If something happens to your ranch," he crossed the room and took the letter back from her hand and set it on the desk, and then, quietly and without urgency, took her face in his 2 large calloused hands. "Listen to me," he said. "I told you when you first came here that the land needed someone who was not frightened. I meant it, but I have been thinking about it differently lately. I think what I meant was that I needed someone who was not frightened, because I have been very careful and very measured and very alone on this land for 4 years, and careful and measured and alone is very good for building a ranch, but it is a cold way to live inside." She looked up at him. Her hands had found his forearms without her deciding to put them there. "Do not sacrifice your ranch for me," she said. "I am not sacrificing anything," he said. "I am choosing." There is a significant difference. He held her gaze. "You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my entire life, Della. I knew it in the first 5 minutes of reading your work. I know it more certainly every day. Whatever happens in Denver, I want you to know that this is not a temporary arrangement for me. I am not built for temporary arrangements." She was not a woman who cried easily. The last time she had cried had been over her father, which was years ago, and she had not cried since because crying required a kind of stillness she rarely allowed herself. But something in her eyes went warm and slightly complicated, and she said, "I have never stayed anywhere," which was the closest she could come in that moment to telling him what she wanted to say, which was that staying here with him was something she had been thinking about with increasing frequency and decreasing terror. "I know," he said. "You can go anywhere you need to go, but you can also come back." She stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his collarbone and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, and he put his arms around her, and neither of them said anything. And outside the window the Colorado night was cold and very clear and full of stars. "I will come back," she said into his shirt. His arms tightened briefly. "I know," he said. "I will also be with you in Denver, so the coming back will be somewhat immediate." She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that releases something long held, and she could feel him smile above her head. They left for Denver the next morning. Denver in 1878 was a city in the process of becoming something larger than itself, brick buildings replacing wooden ones, streets that had been laid out with some actual intention, a rail connection that had changed everything about the speed of commerce and ambition, and trouble arriving from the east. It was busy and noisy and layered in the specific way frontier cities are when they are transitioning from rough to respectable, and Della moved through it with the ease of someone who has spent time in many different kinds of places and has learned how to read them quickly. Judge Everett Caldwell's office was on the third floor of a stone building on Larimer Street. He was a man of 65, thin and dry and extremely alert, with the look of someone who has spent several decades distinguishing between truth and its imitations, and has become very good at the distinction. He received them at 9 in the morning. He read her documentation for 2 uninterrupted hours while she and Luke sat and waited, and during those 2 hours she watched his face and could see, with the expertise of someone who has spent years watching the faces of men reading things that matter, exactly when he understood the full scope of what she had assembled. When he finished, he set the papers down with the precise care of someone handling evidence. "Miss Doyle," he said, "this is remarkable work." "Thank you," she said. "It is also sufficient," he said. "It is more than sufficient. I will be issuing a warrant for Judge Pierce by this afternoon. The corporation will be subject to a full investigation within the week." He paused. "Understand what this will mean for you. The men associated with the corporation will not be pleased." "They are already not pleased," she said. "That is not a new situation." He looked at Luke. "And you are?" "Luke Graves," Luke said. "I run the Sable Creek Ranch south of Mercy Creek. The corporation sent me a threatening letter 2 days ago." Caldwell looked at the papers again, then back at Luke. "You will likely receive more before this is resolved," he said. "I advise you to document everything." "I intend to," Luke said. "And you," Caldwell said to Della, "where will you be during the investigation? We may need you available for additional questions." She opened her mouth. Then she looked at Luke, which she had not intended to do consciously, and he looked back at her with those steady brown eyes that were offering absolutely nothing except a clear space in which she could decide whatever she needed to decide. "I will be at the Sable Creek Ranch," she said. "You can reach me there." They left Caldwell's office and walked out into the thin November sunshine of Denver streets, and she stopped on the sidewalk for a moment and tilted her head back and breathed, feeling something in her chest that she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten it was possible. It felt like the beginning of relief. "Are you all right?" Luke asked beside her. "I am extraordinary," she said. And then, because they were on a public street and she was still herself, "We need to send a telegram to Lawrence, and one to the families, the Parsons family and the Magees and widow Hollies. They should know that something has been filed." "We can do that from the telegraph office on the way back to the hotel," he said. "And tomorrow we should—" "Della," he said. She looked at him. "One evening," he said. "Can we have one evening that is not about the next step?" She looked at this man who had ridden with her to Denver and sat in a judge's office for 2 hours without once making her feel that he was impatient or performing patience. This man who had thought the land needed someone unfrightened and who had turned out to mean himself, and she said, "Yes, we can have one evening." They had dinner in a restaurant on the main street that was fancier than either of them was accustomed to, with actual tablecloths and a menu written on a card, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with land fraud or territorial judges or documentation. He told her about New Mexico, about the ranch before it was taken, about his father's hands which had smelled like horse and earth, and the specific smell of the desert after rain. She told him about Missouri before the war, about her father's horses, about her mother who had been the most practical woman in 3 counties, and who had taught her that the first step to solving any problem was to describe it accurately. "She sounds extraordinary," he said. "She would have liked you," Della said. She had no patience for men who talked more than they observed. He smiled. Not the near smile, but the real one. The one that had become in the last several weeks something she looked for, the way you look for the specific light you associate with a place you have come to love. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was thinking that she was 27 years old and had been in motion for so long that she had stopped knowing the difference between motion and aliveness, and that somewhere in the last 6 weeks she had begun to understand the difference. She was thinking about the study at Sable Creek Ranch and the morning light on the eastern ridge and the way he brought her coffee without being asked because he had noticed, somewhere in the second week, that she worked better with coffee. She was thinking about a future that had the shape of something real and planted rather than something perpetually in transit. "I am thinking," she said carefully, "that Sable Creek is a good base of operations." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "A base of operations." "For the work," she said. "There are more stories, more families that need documenting, more cases that need to go to honest judges. I cannot do that work from a boarding house room. I need a desk with good light and access to the eastern counties and," he said, "and I am thinking," she said, "that a woman who has been labeled reckless in 3 territories might benefit from an anchor." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his grip was warm and very steady. "I am very good at being an anchor," he said. "I have been told I am essentially stationary." She laughed. "You are not stationary. You are rooted. Those are different things." "I stand corrected," he said. "You always do," she said. "It is one of your best qualities." He looked at her with everything he felt for her clear in his face, and making no attempt to be anything else, and said, "Come home, Della." And she said, "Yes." The investigation moved with the speed that powerful evidence tends to produce when it reaches an honest judge who has been waiting for it. By December, Judge Absalom Pierce had been suspended from the bench pending a full inquiry. By January, 3 senior officers of the Colorado Territorial Land and Development Corporation had been indicted on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of public documents. By February, the first of the families who had lost land to the corporation had their cases reopened, and by spring 2 of the 8 families Della had documented had had their properties restored. Not all 8. The law is an imperfect instrument, and the powerful have resources that are difficult to fully overcome. But 6 of the 8 families received either their land back or significant financial settlements, and 2 of the original corporation investors faced criminal trials. It was not everything. It was more than what had existed before Della Doyle rode into Mercy Creek on a brown horse, with the dust of 3 territories on her coat. Sheriff Greer in Caldwell lost his position when the Kansas Territorial Inquiry, prompted by Della's article in the Lawrence paper, finally concluded its investigation in the spring of 1879. 2 deputies were also dismissed. The land she had documented as wrongfully seized in Caldwell began the process of being reviewed, which was slow and imperfect, but which would eventually produce results. Della's article on the Caldwell seizures was published in January by the Lawrence paper and picked up by 2 Denver papers and eventually by a paper in St. Louis. Her documentation of the corporation's activities was referenced in multiple court proceedings and cited by a journalist in Chicago who was writing a broader piece on land fraud in the territories. It was, without question, the most significant work of her career. She wrote most of it at the desk in the study at Sable Creek Ranch, in the morning light that came through the window that looked toward the eastern ridge. She also wrote a letter to Luke in December, which she left on his pillow because she was better on paper than in spoken words when the thing she needed to say was large and real and frightened her slightly with its own size. The letter said that she had spent most of her adult life believing that rootedness was the enemy of the kind of work she needed to do, and that what she had discovered over the past 3 months was that she had been confusing rootedness with stagnation, and that having a place to come back to was not a compromise but a resource. It said that she wanted to stop being a woman who was always leaving and start being a woman who also, sometimes, arrived. It said that she was aware that she was difficult and frequently inconvenient and occasionally prone to walking into traps, and that she was not going to change any of those things, but that she was hoping he would accept them as features rather than flaws. It said, at the end, with a simplicity that cost her quite a lot to write, that she loved him. He read the letter in the morning while she was already at the desk in the study, pretending to work and listening for his boots in the hallway. He appeared in the study doorway. She looked up. "Yes," he said. "Yes, what?" she said. "Yes to all of it," he said. "Every word. I have been waiting for you to write it down because I know that is how you know something is real for yourself." He crossed the room and she stood up from the desk, and he put his hands on her face the way he did, with that particular gentleness, and said, "I love you too. I have loved you since you looked at me in that general store and decided whether I was worth an opinion." "You were," she said. "You are." He kissed her with the thoroughness he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with everything she had been carrying around for 3 months. And outside the window the December light was cold and golden, and the eastern ridge had a dusting of snow on its upper edge that made the whole landscape look like something just written. They were married in March of 1879. The wedding was small and practical, and had exactly the character of both of them held at the Mercy Creek Church, which had survived its argument with the wind, and was doing considerably better with a new minister, attended by Thomas and the other ranch hands, and Elsa Maurer from the boarding house, and 6 or 7 people from town who had by now entirely revised their initial opinions of the woman who had ridden in on a brown horse with 3 territories worth of labels pinned to her back. Harris Polk came up from Pueblo for it. The Parsons family came, the ones whose land had been restored, and Mrs. Parsons brought a pie that she said was a better wedding gift than anything you could buy, which Della privately agreed with. The minister was a small, brisk man named Reverend Alton, who had the look of someone who has heard a great deal in confessionals and is therefore impossible to shock, and he married them with a warmth and brevity that was exactly right. When Reverend Alton asked if there were any impediments, a man at the back said, "I heard she's been labeled reckless in 3 territories," in the tone of someone raising a genuine concern. Luke, without turning around, said, "I know. That is one of the reasons I asked her." There was a sound in the church that was either laughter or agreement or some combination of both, and Della looked at her almost husband with something shining in her eyes that she was not entirely successful at containing, and he looked back at her with that quiet certainty he had about everything that mattered, and Reverend Alton said, "Shall we proceed?" They proceeded. The year that followed was the most fully inhabited year of Della's life, which was not to say it was the easiest, because nothing about the kind of life they were building together was simple. She continued her work. There were more cases, more families, more documentation to gather, and she traveled to do it, to Pueblo and to Denver and twice to Kansas, and once to the New Mexico territory, which was a journey that had additional meaning because of Luke's history there and which he accompanied her on, and which produced a story about water rights disputes in the Rio Grande Valley that ran in 3 different papers and contributed to a legal action that would eventually benefit 4 indigenous Pueblo communities whose water access had been restricted. An injustice she documented with particular care, because she understood that the system she was fighting did not reserve there worse behavior for any one category of victim. She came back from each of these journeys to the ranch. She came back to the study with the good light, and to the evenings that were sometimes quiet and sometimes argumentative in the specific productive way of 2 people who are both very certain of their own thinking and have enough mutual respect to disagree fully and change their positions when they are wrong. She came back to Luke, who was always there and always himself steady and observant and capable of surprise in the moments when she forgot to expect it. In the autumn of 1879, he surprised her considerably. She had come in from the barn on a September afternoon to find him in the kitchen with the specific expression of a man who has something he has been thinking about for a while and has decided the moment has come. He had made coffee, which was his equivalent of setting a stage. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "You are being deliberate," she said. "You have been deliberate since Tuesday." "Since Tuesday," he confirmed. "I have been working out how to say something." "Just say it," she said. "That is generally the most efficient method." He sat across from her. "The Harmon property," he said, 40 acres on the north side of the valley. It went to auction last week. I bought it." Looked at him. "You bought more land." "I bought it with a specific intention," he said. "I want to build a second house on it, not a big one, something solid, because I have been thinking about the families we have met in the last year, the ones who are still displaced, who have their cases in review but know where to live while those reviews proceed. I want to have a place to put people, temporarily, while they wait." She stared at him. "It is not a grand gesture," he said. "It is a practical one. We have the space, and we have the income from the ranch, and it seems like a better use of 40 acres than more pasture." She stood up, came around the table and sat down in his lap, which was not something she did routinely but which felt in this moment like the only correct physical expression of what was happening in her chest. She took his face in her hands the way he did with her and said, "You are the best man I have ever known." He looked slightly flustered, which was genuinely rare and very endearing. "I am a practical man," he said. "It is a practical decision." "It is the most romantic decision you have ever made," she said. "I proposed to you by letter," he said. "I proposed to you by letter," she corrected. "You proposed to me on the porch with your hands full of fence wire and the specific expression of a man who has lost an internal argument with himself." He laughed. "That is accurate," he said. She kissed him once, warm and certain, and then said, "I will help design the house. I know exactly what they will need." "I know you do," he said. "That is why I waited until I had bought the land to tell you, because once you know about a problem you start solving it immediately, and I needed the deed to be signed first." She looked at him with enormous fondness. "You are learning to manage me." "I would never say that," he said. "I am learning to work with the way you work. There is a significant difference." The second house on the North 40 was built by the following spring, a 4-room structure that was solid and well-made and had a garden plot ready to plant. And the first family to stay in it was a woman named Rosa Beaumont, no relation to Thomas, who had 3 children and a land claim in review that took 7 months to resolve, and who spent those 7 months growing the largest kitchen garden in the valley, while her children helped Thomas with the horses, and her eldest, a boy of 12, developed a friendship with Luke that consisted primarily of the boy following Luke around asking questions, and Luke answering each one with complete seriousness. By the time Rosa Beaumont's land claim was resolved, and she and her children packed up to go back to their own property, Thomas had formally asked Luke for a small raise and used the words, "Because this place is becoming a proper community, and that is worth more than the ranch rate." And Luke had given him the raise and also, quietly, built an additional room on the bunkhouse. Della wrote about the North 40 house in a piece that ran in the Denver paper in the spring of 1880. She did not use Luke's name. She described it as a rancher near Mercy Creek, and focused on what the model represented, the possibility of private citizens creating the kind of support systems that displaced families needed during the long legal processes of land recovery. She received more letters in response to that piece than she had received for any previous article, and 2 of those letters were from families who had already lost land and who came to Mercy Creek in the following months, and one of them stayed long enough to buy their own claim in the valley, and eventually became the kind of neighbor who brings preserved fruit in the summer and helps with calving in the spring. In the winter of 1880, Della discovered she was pregnant. She told Luke on a cold Tuesday morning in December, sitting across from him at the kitchen table in the same chairs where they had sat the first morning she came downstairs at the boarding house, in what felt like a very long time ago, and also like something that had happened in a previous and less complete version of her life. She told him factually and directly, in the way she told him everything, and watched his face do something she had not seen it do before. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment with those brown eyes that were showing a great deal more than they usually showed. Then he stood up, came around the table, and knelt down beside her chair the way someone kneels when the enormity of a thing requires a different posture than standing, and he took both her hands in his and looked up at her with an expression that was so open and so unguarded that she felt something in her own throat tighten. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling? What do you need?" She looked at this man kneeling on the kitchen floor holding her hands at 7 in the morning and said, "I need you to get off the floor. You are going to hurt your knees on these boards." He stood and she stood, and he held her very carefully, as though she were something that required careful holding, and she said into his shoulder, "I am very well. I am also somewhat frightened." "I know," he said. "That is completely reasonable. I am frightened too." "You," she said, pulling back to look at him. "Enormously," he said, with the clarity of someone who has decided that honesty in this moment is the only possible response. "I know how to build things and run a ranch and read a water table. I know nothing about being a father. My father knew nothing about it either," she said. "He learned." "Yes," he said, "and then, because it was Luke, I will read about it." She laughed until she cried a little, and he held her through both. Their son was born in August of 1881, a solid and extremely opinionated infant who arrived in the world at full volume and seemed to have opinions about every aspect of his accommodation, the light in the room, the temperature, and the quality of attention available at any given moment. Luke sat with him the first night with the focused concentration he brought to newspapers and legal documents and the behavior of fence lines in heavy wind, studying this small person with the same methodical attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. They named him Samuel, after Della's father. Samuel Graves had his father's eyes and his mother's lungs, and a temperament that appeared to be entirely his own, gregarious and busy and very interested in things, always wanting to be where the action was, which at 6 months meant wherever there was noise or movement or horses. He was, Della wrote in a letter to her cousin in Colorado, absurdly perfect, though she was aware that this was not objective reporting. The ranch grew. The second house on the North 40 cycled through 4 more families over the next 2 years, and 2 of those families stayed permanently in the valley, and the community that Mercy Creek was becoming had a different character than it might have had without the Sable Creek Ranch, and the woman who lived there and the quiet rancher who had decided, 4 years before any of this, that the land needed something he could not quite name until it arrived on a brown horse from the east. The summer of 1882 brought two particular things of note. The first was a letter from a legal firm in Denver informing Luke that the final appeal by the Colorado Territorial Land and Development Corporation had been denied, and that the organization was formally dissolved, and that the last outstanding land claims associated with its fraudulent activities were in the process of final resolution. The letter was dry and legal, and Della read it 3 times. "It is done," she said. He was mending a harness at the kitchen table because he mended harnesses at the kitchen table when he was thinking, which was a habit she had found maddening initially and had come to find deeply homey. He set down the harness. "Yes," he said. "All of it," she said. "The corporation, Pierce, Greer, all of it resolved." "Most of it," he said. "Not every family got everything back. Some of the land was already sold to buyers who acquired it in good faith." "I know," she said, "but the structure that was doing it is gone." "Yes," he said, "it is gone." She set the letter down and looked at him across the kitchen that smelled of coffee and harness oil and the particular smell of their home, which had accumulated over the years the specific character of 2 people living fully inside it. Samuel was asleep in the next room. Through the window she could see the eastern ridge and the long afternoon light on the grass. "We did that," she said. He looked at her. "You did that," he said. "We," she said firmly. He considered. "We," he conceded. The second thing of note that summer was that Della realized she was pregnant again. This she told him in the evening on the porch in the warm August dusk, with the sound of the horses settling in the barn and the first stars becoming visible above the eastern ridge. She had been thinking about how to say it all day, and had ultimately decided that the best approach, as always, was simply to say it. "I am expecting again," she said. He turned to look at her. The expression on his face was the same one from the first time, open, unguarded, enormous, and then he smiled. And it was one of those smiles that take over a face completely, unmanaged and real. "August," he said, using the thing he had taken to calling her occasionally, a reference to the month she had arrived, which she privately found insufferably charming. "Do not call me August," she said, the same thing she always said. "August," he said again, and she stopped pretending to object because they both knew she liked it. He took her hand on the porch rail and they stood together in the warm dusk, looking out at the land that was theirs, not just in the legal sense, not just the acreage and the deed and the cattle count, but in the deeper sense, the sense of place that is built over years by the daily work of being present in it. The east pasture where the grass grew thick now with the adjusted rotation schedule. The barn with the new addition Luke had built the previous spring. The North 40 with its second house where the Beaumont garden had come back to life under new tenants, a young couple with a baby, the baby's laundry hanging on the line and catching the last light. The land, she thought. Land needed this. Not just the reform work, not just the documentation and the court cases and the exposure of the men who had been stealing it piece by piece. The land needed the ordinary human weight of people who intended to stay on it, people who learned its grass and its water and its light and let themselves be learned by it in return. "I have been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "You have been quiet all day, which means thinking." "I want to write a book," she said. "Not just articles. A proper account of everything. The corporation, the families, the legal process. The whole thing from the beginning, documented as a single narrative." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking about this the way he thought about the things she presented to him, seriously, from multiple angles, with the genuine intention of arriving at a real response rather than a reflexive one. "It would be significant," he said. "It would reach people who do not read newspapers," she said. "People in the eastern states who do not understand what is happening out here. It could change the conversation at the federal level." "You would need time," he said. "I would need a great deal of time," she said. "It would take 2 years at least, maybe 3. She paused. "I would not be able to travel as much. Not with Samuel and the new baby both so young." "You do not have to justify the decision to me," he said. "I am not justifying it," she said. "I am thinking out loud." "Think out loud more often," he said. "I like it." She looked at him sideways. "You like everything about me," she said. "You are entirely biased." "Entirely," he agreed. "Write the book, Della." "I will," she said. Their daughter arrived in March of 1883, which was so cold that the horse's breath came in great white clouds in the barn and the water in the trough froze before morning. And she arrived quickly and noisily, and with a full head of dark hair that was clearly her mother's. And she was named Frances Eleanor Graves. Eleanor for Luke's mother, who had died in New Mexico when he was 19, and Frances because Della's mother had always liked the name. Frances was a quieter baby than Samuel had been, observant and deliberate, watching the world from the very beginning with the specific quality of someone who is cataloging information for later use. And Luke held her in the evenings by the fire and read to her from whatever he was reading, which was usually history or land management, or once, an agricultural survey that Frances appeared to find entirely satisfactory. And Della watched them from the desk where she was writing and felt the kind of happiness that is so fully realized that it becomes almost weightless, nothing to carry, just the thing you are living inside. She wrote the book over 2.5 years. She wrote it at the desk in the study with the eastern light, and she wrote it in the evenings when both children were asleep and Luke was reading in the parlor. And she wrote it on the road the summer she traveled to Denver for a week to verify court records with Samuel, who was 3, and came with her because Luke was in the middle of calving season, and also because Samuel was old enough to travel and young enough to be delighted by everything, and it seemed like good training for both of them. The book was published in 1885 by a press in New York that had been seeking exactly the kind of comprehensive first-hand account that Della had assembled. It was called Land and Claim, which was her working title, and which the publisher did not fight because there was nothing more accurate to replace it with. It was reviewed in 12 newspapers and was discussed in 2 congressional hearings, and was translated into German 3 years later for distribution to European immigrant communities, who were then considering the American West as a possible destination, and who needed, very specifically, to understand the mechanisms by which settlers could be protected or exploited. On the day the first copies arrived at Sable Creek, a crate of them, brought out from town by Thomas, who had been dispatched for the purpose, Luke carried the crate in and set it on the kitchen table and opened it and took out a copy and stood holding it with the same quality of focused attention he brought to things he considered important, looking at the cover with her name on it. "Della Graves," he said, because that was the name on the cover. Della Graves. She had been Della Doyle when she rode into 3 territories and was labeled reckless in every one of them, and she was Della Graves now, which was not a loss of the person who had done all of that but an addition, like the ranch that had been built room by room. The name she carried now had more in it, not less. "That is a good name," he said. "It is an excellent name," she said. "I chose it with some care." Samuel came barreling in from the yard, age 4 and at full speed, and stopped dead at the sight of the crate with the slightly exaggerated attention of a child who has learned that crates are interesting. "What is that?" he demanded. "Books," Luke said. "Books your mother wrote." Samuel looked at Della with an expression of serious assessment. All of them," she said. He considered this for a long moment with the solemnity of someone for whom the production of books was evidently a significant undertaking. Then he said, "Can I have one?" "When you can read it," she said. "That seems far away," he said. "It is not so far," Luke said. "We will keep working." Frances, 2 years old and at the determined toddling stage, had appeared in the doorway and was looking at the crate with one hand on the doorframe, and the expression of someone who intends to have opinions about whatever is in there once she figures out what it is. Della looked at her family in the kitchen doorway, her husband with his steady eyes and his large, careful hands, her son who was already picking up a copy of the book, with the reverence of someone who understands that objects matter, her daughter who was making her determined way toward the crate with complete conviction. And she thought about the morning she had ridden into Mercy Creek with the dust of 3 territories on her coat, and a warrant and a reputation, and a very specific kind of loneliness she had not even named for herself. The land had needed someone unfrightened. That was what the quiet rancher had said, in his way, in the general store with a feed sack on his shoulder, and the certainty in his voice of someone who has been thinking about a thing for a long time before saying it. She thought now that it was also true the other way, that she had needed something too, not to be less herself, not to be quieter or more settled or less inclined to ride into traps in the name of the truth. She had needed a place from which to be fully herself, a root system. A man who read her work without being asked and fed her coffee without being reminded, and who told her without drama or demand that she sounded exactly like what the land needed, which was also, underneath it, the closest he could come in that first moment to telling her that she sounded exactly like what he needed. "Are you thinking?" Luke said from across the kitchen. "Always," she said. "What about?" She looked at him. "About how right you were," she said. "About most things." He looked moderately surprised. "Which things in particular?" "The East Pasture rotation," she said. "The North 40, the book." She paused. "Me." He held her gaze with the quiet certainty that had never wavered in all the years she had known him. "I was not right," he said. "I was just paying attention." She crossed the kitchen and kissed him with Samuel and Francis both present and in various states of investigation of the book crate, which produced from Samuel the sound of a child who has discovered that adults are embarrassing, and from Francis no response at all because Francis was focused on the books and had not yet developed an opinion about parental affection as a social phenomenon. "Your children are watching," she said against his mouth. "Our children," he said. "And Samuel is going to have opinions about a great many things in life. He may as well start early." She laughed. "You are very correct about that too," she said. He put his arms around her in the kitchen with the crate of her books on the table and the eastern light coming through the window and the ranch that they had built together, room by room and acre by acre, in the land that had waited for both of them to arrive, and said into her hair, "Come read it to me tonight." "The whole thing," she said. "However much you want," he said. "I have time." She had written about recklessness. She had written about land and claim and the systems that protect and destroy both. She had written about 14 families in Kansas, and 8 in Colorado, and 4 Pueblo communities in New Mexico, and a circuit judge whose corruption had gone unaddressed for 4 years, and about the mechanisms that had allowed it and the mechanisms that had stopped it. She had not written about this, about the specific quality of being home, but she knew, in the way she knew things that were true enough to stake her life on, that it was the best part of the story. The part that had made all the other parts worth doing. The quiet rancher in the general store with his steady eyes who had said she sounded exactly like what the land needed, and who had said it with the particular calm of a man who has been waiting for a thing he did not yet know he was waiting for, and who recognized it without drama or hesitation the moment it rode in from the east. She stayed. She came back. She arrived. And the land and the man who was rooted in it received her fully. That was the thing that lasts. Not the articles in the papers, not the crate of books on the kitchen table, not the warrant or the crooked sheriff or the corporation's dissolution, though all of those things mattered and had cost real things to achieve. What lasts is this: 2 people who were each other's right answer to a question they had been asking for years, in a house built room by room on land that was learning to trust the people who lived on it, with children who would grow up knowing both how to fight for what is right and how to come home at the end of it. What lasts is Samuel Graves at 4 years old holding his mother's book with both hands and looking at it with that sober assessment, and Francis Graves at 2 discovering that the pages make a very satisfying sound when you turn them, and Luke Graves reading by firelight in the evenings while his wife wrote at the desk in the room with the eastern light, and Della Graves, who had been labeled reckless in 3 territories, and had been, in all 3, absolutely right writing the next true thing. Outside, the Colorado land stretched in every direction, wide and honest, and full of the particular possibility that belongs to places that have been fought for and kept. The grass in the east pasture was thick and good. The cattle moved through the long light in the slow copper-colored way that means a herd is content. The North 40's second house had smoke from its chimney, the young couple with the baby making their life in it, the baby's first winter going well. The eastern ridge held the last of the day's light a little longer than the rest of the valley, as it always did, as though it was reluctant to let go of something worth seeing. Inside, Luke put another log on the fire and called to Della that the coffee was ready, and Samuel asked for the third time whether he could hold one of the books, and Frances said something that was either a word or the attempt at one, and Della set down her pen and came to where her family was, and the evening settled in around them all like something that had been waiting a long time to arrive and intended, now that it had, to stay.